Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Eretz Israel. I'm R Avraham Shira, and we're doing a special class tonight on the Haggadah, and I call it time travel in the Haggadah. And we're going to talk about some very interesting ideas that are connected to both modern psychic understanding, postmodern or post-quantum physics, and of course ancient Kabbalah, connected to the Haggadah, the rendition of the reading over of the Passover story that has been passed down to us from the sages of Israel. So the first question, though, is I want to raise is what is time? So time, there are many types of time. And there's simple time, there is human time, there is Jewish time, there is godly time. And as we look at these definitions, we'll see that it's not as simple as we think. Now, simple time is simply the measurement of the movement of an object in space. That when an object goes from A to B, it takes a certain amount of time. And so we measure things in time. You know, when you want to ask somebody how far it is to Jerusalem, do they mean in miles, or do they mean in how much time it will take you to get there? And of course, that is relative to many other factors. So simple time is simply the movement of objects in space and the measurement of that movement. Now, human time is a little more complicated because we introduce the sun and the moon and the earth. Now, the sun and the moon and the earth are also objects moving in space. But we see that it's not the moon's perception or the sun's or the earth, it's human beings on earth perceiving the movements of these objects. So our minds become filters of time. In other words, if you ask an animal at the zoo what time it is, and he'll say, well, it's time to eat. Right? He's not measuring time by the movement of the sun. He might, by the end of the day, he knows it's time to go inside his cave. And see, all animals have their own cycles of time as well. Migrating birds know they have an inner clock that tells them when it's time to fly to a new continent. And other animals have their own inner clocks for producing babies, is another way of animals perceiving time. Human beings also have that clock. But in other words, the perception of time by a human being is more complex than simple time because it relates to these stellar objects. Now, Jewish time, of course, is the passage of Jewish events through a series of calendars. Right? We have a daily calendar, we have weekly, we have monthly, we have yearly, we have every 7 years, the sabbatical, and then we have a every 28-year cycle called the solar calendar, which is actually, it's not a calendar, but it's a measurement of where the sun reaches, when the sun reaches the place it was in the beginning of creation. Every 28 years, the sun passes that point in the heavens. And we make a blessing called the Birkat Ahama, the blessing of the sun, because it's come back 28 years to get back to that point in the sky. And then, of course, we have the Jubilee cycle, which is a 50-year measurement of time. So Jewish time is obviously deeply connected to the history of the Jewish people, but it is still connected to other various cycles, like the Shemitah, the 7-year cycle that we're in this year, is because the Torah commanded us to let the earth rest and to not to grow things and let the earth replenish itself with minerals, etc. So there's all of a sudden we introduce the concept of the biology and the geology of land connected to time. So part of the idea of relativity that Einstein introduced and mathematically deduced is the interaction of all things with all things in a very simply put way. Okay, and the relationships that they have. And often those relationships are expressed through time, because God created time in order to give us perspective. Now we're going to see now, what is godly time? Well, this is the Torah's measurement of God's works. In other words, the Torah gives us measures of time for the things that God did, like, of course, the 6 days of creation. Now, we have in the 90th Psalm, King Moses said that a day, 1,000 years is like a day in your eyes, right? 1,000 years of human time is 1 day for a human being. Now, that forms an equation. And it's a very interesting equation because it gives us a lot of other information when we look at it. 1,000 human years is 1 day for God. We're just here in Eretz Israel. It's 9 o'clock or so at night, right? We've started a new day. We finished a day. Okay. A godly day is 1,000 human years. Nobody lives 1,000 years, but that's a day in God's eyes. So a godly day is 1,000 human years, or another way of saying it is a godly year is 365,000 human years. Now, there's a lot that can be said about the measurement of time from the beginning of creation, according to the astrophysicists, which is about 13 billion years and change, right? And Rabbi Kaplan worked out an equation of the number of stars that have been found in the universe, and related those number of stars to the number of permutations of the 22 letters of the Aleph Bet, and they come up very close to each other. And there are many crossover equations between physics and Torah that can be made. For our purposes, because we're interested in Passover, which is going to happen hopefully tomorrow night, wherever you are, the redemption took place 3,335 years ago, give or take a year or so. That's 3.5 godly days. Now that's interesting, isn't it? The redemption of Egypt, of the Jewish people leaving Pharaoh and entering the desert, and that was halfway through a godly week. 3.5 days. Interesting. In other words, we understand that we've already learned in the Kabbalah that this creation as we know it, with our physical bodies, with the perception, the tools that we have, is 7,000 years. Okay, so we're essentially looking at every 1,000 years is 1 day in God's eyes. So for God, it's a 6-day creation plus 1,000-year Shabbat. Now, this is an idea that the Christians have picked up on, and other spiritual people. But why is this important to us now? Well, I think of it like this, that, if you take on a job that's going to take you a week, say someone says, build me a cabin, a very simple cabin. It came on a truck. All you got to do is nail the walls together, put on the roof, and put the windows and doors on. It's a week project. For God, this whole creation as we know it is a week's work to put it together. Now, but it's not a week as we understand it. 7 human days. It's 7 divine days. And 7 divine days we already established is 7 times 365,000 years. So if you do the math, then you come up with, several million more years that it took God to create the creation story as we live it. Now, there are some people that say that, of course, time changes. This is another thing that Einstein taught. As the faster an object moves, the more time contracts. So that, the whole famous science fiction movie where people go off in space at a super high speed and they come back and everybody's 20 years older. And they haven't aged because they've been moving so fast. So you see, the faster an object moves, the less it ages. So that has impact on our understanding of creation time, because when we had this colossal moment called the Big Bang by scientists, which in Kabbalah is called the Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels, that moment, it stands to reason that all matter was moving very, very fast. And only over time does matter slow down as it gets further and further from the source or the inception of its power. So you see, time is changing as things move. So it could have been, we have, Noah lived to be 930 years. He gave 70 years to King David. 930 years, like who could ever bear to be here that long, Think about it. But if time was moving faster because the planet was moving faster, if time was contracting, then his 930 years might be something different than we think of as when we think of 930 of our years. You see? And so how you live your life and the passage of the time in your life is very much directed towards how fast your mind perceives reality. Or, in other words, how much you experience time moving fast or slow. Now, what all of this is, I want to bring us to an idea is that time is relative to the tools and the parameters of the measurement that it is measuring. So your tools will impact your ability to measure time. Now, nowadays they have these super advanced atomic clocks that can measure into the millionth of a second. And they have calculated that the further something gets from another object, which of course means the weakening of the force of gravity, as the weakening of the force of gravity takes place, in other words, you get further from the planet, there's less time. Because objects are impacting each other through the force of gravity. I.e., when you get further from Earth, you get younger. That makes sense. No wonder everybody wants to take a trip on SpaceX, fly out into space at 50,000 miles an hour and you come back younger. Why not, right? Well, it's a little more than that, but the idea is that the tools of our perception, well, of course, that's our mind and that's our eyes and our ears and even when you smell something and you remember something from the past, you're drawing the past into the present. And that's a big, important part of how the human being is created in God's image. Because God experiences all things as one. Now, Rebbe Nachman teaches another interesting idea which will help us understand this quantum understanding much easier. He says it like this: the larger your consciousness, your God consciousness is, the less bound you are to time. The less impact time has on you. The less you think about things like, oh, I'm 61 years old. Oh, my back hurts. Oh, when will I get my Social Security? When a person has expanded consciousness of God, we don't think about those types of things too much, right? Because those things are here and now in the physical realm. And the more we're attached to the spiritual realm, well, the faster time passes. And so we actually become younger as we get older, because you become less attached to the physical. So when you expand your perception, time has less impact, and all of a sudden we're less attached to this world and more attached to the place above time. And well, where's the place above time? Well, we call it heaven. And it has many, many rooms over there, a lot of hotels, a lot of condos, a lot of layers of timelessness in heaven, okay? Now, where we can see this in our everyday life is very simple. When you go on a trip and you're anticipating arriving, what happens? The trip goes slow. How many times did the kids sit in the back seat, when are we going to get there? When are we going to get there? Because they're anticipating the arrival of that 20-mile journey or 50-mile or 200-mile, whatever it might be, and their anticipation slows down time. And when you come back from the journey, and they're not asking about what time you're going to get there because, they're not interested anymore, suddenly things don't take as long. Because why? I'm not attached to a goal. I'm not attached to a physical goal in the physical world of arriving somewhere. So suddenly time speeds up when I'm not attached to where I'm going. And it seems very, very slow on the highway when I'm covering the same distance. So you see, time is perceptual in our reception of it. Now, another way we see it is in love. What happens when you're in love? You rise quickly above time. You know, you look at your watch. Wow, we've been on a date for 5 hours. Unbelievable. The sun is coming up and you don't even notice. But that's what happens when you're in love, because you're going above time. And that's, of course, teaches us that the heart is a filter of time. And when our heart is open, because that's what love does, it opens the heart, then, well, what happens if the heart opens and you feel love? Then, of course, you don't have the constrictions of the physical world on your perception. And that's part and parcel, a big part of what we want to approach Passover with. That the restrictions of the physical world are not, they're real, but they don't have to be. Because we have free choice. And we can decide where I put my mind at any given time. And where I put my mind will actually bind it up into that. Let's talk more about that in a moment. All right, so but remember those days when you fell in love and there was no time, or those times when you went on a journey and things went fast. And what happens when you're bored? What happens when you're bored? Your mind is not engaged. And so everything slows down, right? And nobody likes to be bored that I ever met. What happens when you're bored? You're not interested in things. Your mind is not attaching to ideas. And so the not interested is another way of saying, well, not really in love with what I'm doing. And that slows time down and things go really like the inui of the thing. That's an old word. I don't even know if we use it anymore. The inui, maybe it's pronounced, right? That sense of nothing's moving, nothing's happening, and I can't bear it. So that's because we're not using our mind as a time travel tool. Okay, remember that. Your mind is your time travel tool. Now you could say, well, Avraham, I'm not psychic and I'm not part of the CIA, remote viewing program. It's true. But as Jews, as spiritual people that are approaching Passover, who are being asked to look back at time over and over throughout the whole Haggadah, and then the Haggadah is going to tell us we have to look forward into the Messianic promises. What's going on? We're being pushed around time. But the Haggadah, written with the Ruach HaKodesh of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, that's what the Malbim says. Rav and Shmuel, two great sages from the Talmud, argue who actually was the author of the Haggadah. And that's important too, because the Haggadah is a compilation. It is not one man sitting down to write a book. It is somebody or more than one person gathering in teachings and statements and stories and putting them together into this book. Well, it's not really a book. It's shorter than a book. That's why I call it a manual, right? The Haggadah is this manual to take us backwards and forward in time to re-experience something of Passover during the first Passover when Moses and the folks came out of Egypt, and then Passover, 2,000 years ago in the Second Temple period. And then, of course, there's been many other Passovers till this week. But each one is somewhere in time. And yet there's something about all of them that is above time. And that's what we're working towards understanding. So remember, feelings modulate your perception of time. And if you're bored, well, you could ask yourself, why am I bored? That's going to be a good start. But the answer you come up with is very important, because if you get the right answer, you're not going to be bored anymore. Just using your mind takes you out of the boredom and out of the slowness of the passage of life. And things become very exciting when we learn to pay attention and use our mind to do so. Because it's very, if you watch a butterfly, he's very interested in what he's doing. Why am I not interested? Why? And what Kabbalah makes you a natural scientist, because it teaches you to pay attention to everything. And when you pay attention to everything, it's interesting. And when it's interesting, you're never bored, and then your mind is moving quick from item to item, from moment to moment, from thing to thing. And it all has significance. Okay. Now, time travel. What is time travel? Well, it's the movement of the vehicle of perception. Your mind, as we said, is a vehicle of perception, but it moves. It speeds up, it slows down, it turns right, it turns left. It goes up, it goes down. Now, in meditation classes that I've been teaching for years already on Web Yeshiva and Insight Timer and Lighthouse, etc., you'll see that I've mentioned these kinds of ideas over and over. Because in your inner mind, what I call the inner theater, which is the third eye, the eye of the intellect, your inner theater where you project visions and where they're projected to you and through you, right? Those images that you're shown are part of what's called Ma'aseh Merkava in Kabbalah, which is the chariot of the actions of the chariot. Well, what the chariot is your mind. And what's a chariot? It moves from place to place. Now, back in the day, they didn't drive around in SUVs, but they drove around in chariots. So they gave the appropriate metaphor for the vehicle of the day. But the vehicle of all days is your tool of perception. Okay, and what we are not taught is that we are not bound in our little life here and now. That we can actually change places, like the Baal Shem Tov taught over and over. You are where you think. He didn't say you are where you think you are, because that could be illusory. But wherever you're thinking of, that's where you are at that moment of that thought. And that's very important to understand, because when you become attached to what you're thinking and you look at what you think, then you start to understand how you move around, and even in history, which is what the Haggadah is trying to do, is move us around in history. Now, in psychic experience, it's called remote viewing, as I mentioned, and the psychic's mind travels to an image. Now, you can look this up, if wherever you'd like, that the way that oftentimes like FBI or the KGB or the CIA, whoever is using psychics to find out information, well, Judaism has been doing that for years by going to Kabbalists and asking them where people are. Someone got kidnapped. Rabbi Meir Abasera said, bring me a map of London, because that's where a Jew was kidnapped, and he just pointed on the map, and they went to that location and they found him. How did he know? Because God used his mind to show them, for the sake of the person who was kidnapped and their family. Why? Because the tzaddik, the righteous person's mind, was available to the journey to show them, and it didn't take long at all. And how do you see? Because once you have a map, is another way of charting psychic space, but it's just using the planet as the space of travel. Okay. So the psychic's mind, or the tzaddik's mind, can go forward and backward in time according to the needs of the moment. Now, what the Kabbalah demands is holiness to enter this realm of activity. I don't know if the CIA or the KGB are really worried too much about holiness. Let's leave that alone, because, we don't want to get sanctioned, do we? Right? They might sanction my kippah, or something. So, where is the mind traveling, though? When we go where we go, in our thoughts, in our dreams, in our visions, when you focus on the letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei in your davening, where are you going? Well, you say, I'm going in my mind, but where's your mind going? So we have a kavanah that we have every day. We do it 3 times a day. You're supposed to think of yourself at Har Abayit down the road here. That's where you're supposed to see yourself praying, not in your living room in Tennessee. So when you really understand this teaching, you can go to Har Abayit, to the Kotel Ma'aravi, and pray your morning prayer, if your mind is free enough and pure enough. And I think it's important to also state that we're not all going to achieve these great levels that the Baal Shem Tov and Rabbi Nachman is teaching us, but and certainly not at once. But it still should build our faith in what we do, and build our faith in who we're connected to. Because those things, those ideas, actually make our awareness grow and expand, and then we actually see that we're part of something very, very grand. Okay, so the mind travels above time. What is above time? Well, I like to think of it as timeless. It's timeless. It's not connected to past. It's not connected to present, and it's all in the future. It's all in the now. I didn't say that right. Okay, one more time. Where past, present, and future join, that is the timeless state. So to speak, they're canceling out our perception of what happened in the past, what will happen in the future, what's happening now. So the above time level is where we cancel out the past, that's gone. Cancel out the future, that's gone. It's not here yet. And the now is actually where we enter. It's the portal, is the now. You have to be attached to the now if you want to go into the above time. And being aware of time, of the now, is a very common New Age idea. Many books have been written about it. Many people practice trying to be in the now, mindfulness, presence. These are all good things. But in Judaism, especially in Kabbalah, we understand it's only the beginning of the journey. Okay, and the journey, of course, when we enter above time, where past, present, and future are one, when we enter above time, we're entering heaven, or an aspect of it. And this place we call heaven is, well, for lack of a non-New Age term, we're entering the mind of God. Because all this creation is happening through his mind. And so when we leave the body, we're entering there. Because that's all there really is we are encapsulated in his mind. There's a concept called moach echad that's used in various areas, but the one moach, of course, is God's brain and God's mind. Now, so where does time travel take place? In this above time space, which is hyperspace. And this hyperspace is really, it's not a place you get to enter on your own. You have to be invited. You have to be permitted access into this divine mind. But when we do the work of disconnecting all our tethers, all the stanchions that are holding the rocket in place, when those are removed, then the rocket can take off. And the rocket, of course, is this time travel vehicle called our perception. But it can't be bound by worries and concerns and sins and all kinds of earthly bound concepts. Because those are too dense, right? We're trying to enter an area that's very not dense in terms of psychic space. Okay. Now, and what happens when we apply this to the Haggadah, you start to see that the Haggadah is bouncing around from the present and to the mind of the author, into the minds of the speakers in the story, and back into back into King David's mind, and then we're back into Rabbi Yehuda Nassi's mind, and we're bouncing around. But we have to remember one thing: the Ruach HaKodesh of every rabbi is the same Shekhinah. It's one God. It's one Shekhinah, but it speaks through King David, through Rabbi Yehuda Nassi, and through, well, sometimes it'll speak through us as well. So we have to understand that oneness is what we're after. Because a lot of times we think, oh, that's the Rebbe, he's on the high level, and he is. But the Shekhinah he's getting is the same one you're after. So don't allow the mind to compartmentalize the divine. It's not. Okay, now, in the Haggadah, which, we're going to do part 2 of this class, hopefully tomorrow, because there's still a lot more to say, and I have pages of notes. And we're going to cover the different aspects of the Haggadah and how they relate to this journey. Because the Haggadah is moving us in and out of the past, the present, and the future. And we kind of have to get used to the journey. And if we pay attention, then actually you're already going to enjoy and taste the pleasure of the divine presence that was used in the writing of the Haggadah. Because Rabbi Yehuda Anasi doesn't just sit down and write. And his Rebbe was Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi. And Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, of course, had a tradition further back. We're talking about 170 AD, what we call, or CE, Common Era, up to 230, 240 of the Common Era. So we're talking about a 70-year span of time. That's a long time. Imagine if we started writing a book together and we'll say, well, we'll finish it in 70 years. You'd laugh. You'd think, what? Why? Well, because that's what a compilation does. It brings in the divine inspirations of all types of players in the story. But it's still one story, one projection, one animation, one life-giving entity behind it all. And when we can get closer to that, then the pieces of the story start to come together in a very beautiful and transformative way. Okay. Now, I did want to add one piece of the Haggadah for tonight's teaching that I think is very useful. And that's when we hold up the matzah in the beginning, we call, Hey Lachman Anya. This is the bread of affliction. Now, there's a way we can understand bread. There's many ways we can understand bread of affliction. But I like to think it like this. Our afflictions become bread. What is bread? Bread is nourishment. Nourishment is life force. So the very things that afflict us, that hurt us, that we've gone through, that we wouldn't have chosen to go through if we had that choice, well, we didn't have the choice for a reason, because God knew what he was doing in running our lives. The bread of affliction is the bread, the sustenance that we derive from affliction. It's when we take the trials and the traumas and the abuses of this world and this life, and we turn them and we understand them, when we explore them, when we open them up to find the Creator inside them, then they become bread. They become life force. They become the matzah that will take us out into the desert. And, in the desert, there's no Whole Foods out there. Each man for himself. But we don't operate actually that way. The Jewish people are never each man for himself, because that's part of the secret of our survival. So the redemption story is, I believe, the most momentous occasion in the history of humanity, and maybe even the entire universe, in God's heart. God is the one who's looking forward to Pesach more than we are, because it's a commemoration of his transforming the human race, and a big turn in the history of humanity. And if you think about it, if you're a parent, do you remember when one of your kids turned the corner? When one of your kids got off something, or got out of a bad relationship, or one of your kids changed their life for the good? It becomes precious to the parent. So how precious is Pesach to God? And let's take that idea into our heart. And if we remember how precious it is to him, maybe it's going to be more precious to us. And then maybe we're going to change time with that open heart. So God bless you all. We'll look for you tomorrow. Is Erev Shabbat, Erev Pesach, Friday. And we'll continue this little discussion. And God bless you all. Have a great evening and a great day and a good, happy preparation. We did a class last night after 12 hours of work, around the house. We did a little class on the Kabbalah of cleaning. So I highly recommend taking a look over there as well. God bless you all. Shabbat Shalom.